Last vocabulary for the week. Good job if you've made it this far. These are words from the fire and the wave or hunting snake. Now the first one is shrewd, which means clever and careful, oftentimes in a slightly negative way. It doesn't have to be, but oftentimes if an author chooses to use this word, they're meaning it in like a little bit of a shady way. So a shrewd customer always looks for the best price. That isn't necessarily negative, nor is the next sentence, but just know that sometimes it has that. It could just mean clever and careful. So long ago there lived an old shrewd man named Hamaguchi. So he was very clever, as you saw in the story. Favorable is the next word. It means giving a benefit or advantage. Helpful would be a synonym for it. So you could say the favorable winds made it a good day to fly a kite. The earth was rich and favorable for farming is how it's used in the story. It's an adjective. Both of these are adjectives. They describe, usually shrewd describes people. Favorable describes like things like the earth or the winds, or like the weather was looking favorable. I wouldn't really describe a person as that generally. Parched. Parched is another word that is usually an adjective, could technically be a verb because to parch is to dry, I believe. But generally it's an adjective meaning very dry or thirsty. So the crops were parched because of the sun. If it beats down, it dried them out. Sometimes you say like, my throat is parched. I'm feeling parched. He thrust his torch into the parched brown rice stalks. So they were really dry. So that's presumably why he chose to burn them, because he knew they would burn and get everyone's attention. Scarcely. Scarcely is like almost not, or just barely. So I was so happy that I could scarcely speak. So think about barely as being a synonym. So if you use that in a sentence, you could generally replace it with the word scarcely. We scarcely thought about anything because we were so frightened, is in the hunting snake. I adjusted it a little bit because it's a poem. It's a little hard to quote directly when you're trying to show what a word means. Idle. Not active or in use, not working. Sometimes you think of a car being an idle. That's a slightly different definition than this. So the factory sat idle after the company went out of business, not being used. At first his gaze was idle, but then he sat up and squinted. That but tells us that there's a contrast between the two parts of the sentence. So at first it was like he was just chilling. Not that his eyes were closed, but you know how you kind of zone out? So he was just kind of staring off into space. But then he sat up and squinted. So then it was like he was at attention. His eyes really were working. Clench. Clench is to close tightly shut or to like grip something. So he clenched his fists in anger. As he saw the tsunami, he felt his stomach clench in fear. Like gripped, closed, that like clench, because you're nervous or angry or feeling some sort of strong emotion. Intent is your plan or goal or intention. So my intent is to become rich. This is an interesting use in the poem. The small food fled from his fierce intent. So in this time it's almost like his eyesight. But he was like so focused, this snake was so focused on like where it was going or looking for food that you could think of it as like its plan was to find some food. So sometimes poets use words in slightly different ways. So it's like, I wouldn't necessarily say like, my intent is really fierce as like my eyesight, but in this case, that's kind of how it is. Like the snake was so focused. His plan, his goal was to find some food. So the like small food, like a mouse or something, ran away. And then this last one, So this is another one where the poet uses it in an interesting way. So reeling can mean like turning in circles or kind of swaying or staggering. So like if you just got hit, you might be reeling because you're trying to get your balance. So the exhausted runner was reeling after the marathon. They were like so tired that they were kind of swaying and couldn't quite walk straight. But in the poem, it uses the great black snake went reeling by. Now, do I think the snake was turning in circles? No. Do I think it was necessarily staggering? No. From the rest of the poem, it seemed like it wasn't like going in circles, or it wasn't like staggering all over the place. Just makes me wonder if the author was trying to describe how it was kind of weaving back and forth, and so use the word reeling to kind of get this idea that it was like going back and forth. You know how snakes move. So that's just where it's like, okay, clearly the author used it in a slightly different way because that's what it means. All right? So feel free to just use the like staggering or turning in circles definition of the word. Let me know if you have any questions, and good luck.